Psychedelics Go is one of the leading advisories in the emerging psychedelic industry, and we hope that this content will be informative, and we look forward to any conversations that we may be able to assist with on the other side of today's curriculum. All right, without further ado, I want to get right to our content, and I'm delighted to introduce the moderator of our first panel regarding the FDA, Ms. Melissa Lavasani, who has an incredible resume and background in life, of course, but in the psychedelic industry. And I'll just give you a few highlights. They're too lengthy to review given the time we have. Melissa is the founder and executive director of Plant Medicine Coalition. And prior to founding the Plant Medicine Coalition, Melissa was the proposer of Washington, D.C.'s successful 2020 ballot measure Initiative 81, the Ethniogenic Plant and Fungus Policy Act. So we're going to say that Melissa has taken out her chisel and carved her name into history by showing her leadership on Initiative 81. In addition to her advocacy, she's had her own user experience helping her deal with some mental health issues that she suffered, and really is a leader by taking charge of the Decriminalize Nature DC campaign to the largest ballot initiative victory in the history of our nation's capital. So just incredible foundational stuff. I will throw it to Melissa to get going on our first panel of the day.
Thank you, Paul, for the kind words. Just fair warning, there's some work being done on my street in my neighborhood, so I apologize if there's any background noise, and I will go on mute whenever I'm not speaking to avoid interruptions. So good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to the first panel, the FDA and psychedelics. Where are we today? My name is Melissa Lavasani. As Paul said, I am founder and executive director of Plant Medicine Coalition, a member association located in Washington, D.C. that is advocating for psychedelics on a federal, state, and local level. I started Plant Medicine Coalition because I saw how critical it was for the psychedelic ecosystem to have a direct line and a unified voice to our government, especially our lawmakers in Congress and the executive office of the president. In recent years, psychedelics have made amazing cultural and political advances in our society, and legalization has almost become an inevitable outcome. There are multiple paths and various outcomes that will measure psychedelic progress in our near and far future. One major path being pursued currently is through the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. While this process can be long and drawn out and cost millions of dollars, our panel today is stacked with some amazing experts in the field, and hopefully they will be able to provide some clarity on the current trajectory of psychedelics through the FDA. Joining me today are Jon Dennis. He is an entrepreneur in the psychedelic ecosystem and an attorney from Oregon. His interests include psychedelic retreats, wellness centers, hospitality, the religious use of plant and fungi medicines, equity, education, facilitator training, cultivation, production, really a jack of all trades, and especially has some really awesome knowledge on Oregon's Measure 109, the Psilocybin Services Act. Today also we have Dr. Jishan Chadhuri, who is an MD, PhD. So he studied at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He is an entrepreneur with experience in the healthcare space, trained in psychedelic assisted therapy through CISS, and is now bringing his expertise to a really amazing company called Journey Colab. He is founder and CEO. They are truly a one-of-a-kind drug development company that is going down a traditional drug development path, but is focusing on community engagement, equitable access, and inclusive reciprocity. We also have Dr. Ahmad Doroudian, who is CEO and director of BetterLife Pharma, which is focused on developing second-generation psychedelic compounds and nutraceuticals for the mental health, wellness, and anti-aging industries. Dr. Doroudian has over 20 years of experience in pharma and is well-versed in all facets of drug development, like acquisition, integration, tech transfer, and management of pharmaceutical products. I believe we had one more person joining the panel. Hannah, okay, there she is. Hannah McLane, Dr. Hannah McLane. Hannah is a neuroscientist, physician, psychotherapist, and in 2010, she founded the SoundMind project, whose mission is to make psychedelic-assisted therapies affordable, accessible, and affirming all patients, with a focus on BIPOC, LGBTQ, and neurodiverse individuals. SoundMind's focus is on, psychedelic ethics, informed consent and ethics and distributive justice, as well as psychedelics for cognitive diversity and PTSD. So now that we're all here and we've got the introductions out of the way, Hannah, will you be able to give us a brief summary on the progress that's been made in the FDA with psychedelics and just give us kind of a lay of the land of what's been happening here recently?
Yeah, sure. I think it's there's so much going on with different initiatives within the state and federal level, and I think it's really hard for people to keep it straight. So I teach classes for psychedelic facilitators, and it's like the number one question, like, how do we know what's going to happen and how do we prepare for it? So I think it's important to look at, the federal level. We're going through various phase 2 and 3 trials for things like psilocybin. MDMA is at the last stage of phase 3 trials, and expecting those to, MDMA will likely be approved in the next couple of years, and then it will have to go through a state process that will allow it to then be a prescribable medicine. And psilocybin is a little bit further behind in the federal level. And at the same time, we have, and then there's other psychedelics like LSD that's like even earlier. So we're looking at 5 or 10 years probably, realistically. And then at the local level, which I know others will also talk about, there are state initiatives. And I think most of those fall into like decriminalization, legalization, or what's happening in Pennsylvania and New York is sort of proposing loosening restrictions on research so that we can actually like grow psilocybin and then research it. And that would be the first step. Oregon is an amazing model, and I'm really excited to have intersections with them in our training program as well, and that we can most likely that training programs can happen across the country. So I think it will be really interesting that there will be all these facilitators in different states, sort of focusing on what's happening in Oregon to prepare for different places to then follow suit. I think that once Oregon is really up and running, I do think it will, other states will see how it's going and then maybe adopt the same thing and require the same facilitator trainings and things like that. So, and I think at the federal level is also sort of being influenced by the states, noticing what's working, what's not, and sort of that allows them to have less restrictions or maybe push things forward. So I think it's really interesting that they're kind of converging in different areas. And, at SoundMind, we try to be involved in all of those, like very hyper local, but also helping with the federal bills and the state bills, and keeping up to date with Oregon, and collaborating with some of the folks out there for some of the in-person trainings that will be required. So I'm excited, and I'm curious to hear what other panelists think about. A lot of this is like, your powers of prediction. I think there's no guarantee. It's sort of like, I think I have landed on this area because I kind of have a good ability to see a couple years in the future. And that's kind of why I'm good at real estate too. I'm like, this is the corner that's going to be like, everyone's going to be hanging out on. So I think it's kind of like seeing patterns and noticing, how restrictions get loosened, and, what might be required and what might not be. And then as we come together, there will also be different groups that come together and create bodies that will certify people and certify organizations. And we're really at the infancy right now. So it's exciting.
Yeah, thank you. And just to follow up, since I know you're involved in the Pennsylvania research bill that's being proposed right now, what if there's any interaction with federal FDA, how do you think that relationship is going to go? I know there's a couple other initiatives that involve interplay between federal agencies and state agencies, and there's a bit of tension that we can get into with other initiatives happening right now. Do you think the FDA will be a partner in all this? Do you think they will be a speed bump for initiatives like this, or what's your feeling about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think that question comes up with people, so I was really excited about Oregon. I was like, oh, I'm going to go out there and talk to all my, MD friends. And they're like, we don't actually know. It's almost easier if you're in Oregon and you don't have a license, because we don't entirely know if the federal government's going to care. I think it was kind of like the early days of cannabis, that you're not sure if they're going to like march in and say like, this is federally illegal. And like, this is against your medical license. So I think we're going to have to wait for certain, older doctors to try it out and see what happens, or like, therapists that don't care as much. But I think it really, I think there are different strategies, and that's, I haven't written the bills. I'm supporting, like Brett Waters is the one who's drafting some of those bills. And I have a meeting with him after this, actually. And it's really about like, how much are you just going to declare what's happening in the state versus try and figure out what might be amenable to the federal level and like have them be more supportive. So I think the strategy in Pennsylvania and New York is more like, let's try and make it not too scary for the federal government. Like we're just saying it's going to be universities conducting research and not so much restrictions because it's a scheduled substance. Rather than like Oregon, who's saying like, this is an ideal version of what we want to see, and I think that the Pennsylvania version is like it's like the first step in the ideal version. I think Oregon is a more ideal version, that we're having inclusivity and access and having various people be able to become facilitators, even if they're not licensed. I believe that's really important for access. And so right now, the Pennsylvania bill, it still is going to be people that have, licenses, and it'll be doctors and researchers and, institutions, and hopefully SoundMind will be able to conduct some of this research, but it is still a little bit ivory tower restricted. So, I think I believe that it's the best way to go to try to work with the federal level as much as possible. And I think Oregon is doing that too. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And I don't think any of us totally know. I think it's exciting,
Right.
but yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting because you definitely have to take, cultural considerations into this and understand that our federal government is very risk averse. And, we are going to have to hold their hands through this entire process. So
Right.
every state's going to look a little different.
Right. And I think there's just a sense of urgency that so many people are suffering. Right. I was talking to Rick Doblin yesterday, and it's like, there is a sense of urgency in the psychedelic space. There's a lot of like money coming in and other things, but it's also urgent because our wait list is gigantic. We're the only people in Pennsylvania right now providing ketamine assisted therapy. And I think there's a couple other groups starting, but it's just like, people need this, people are stuck. And I think the faster we can go while also being aware that we need to, not upset the federal government as much as possible, I think is the way to go.
Yeah, which is a perfect segue to my next question for Jeeshan. In your experience, how is this growing field of psychedelic studies and clinical trials? How are the regulators adapting to this new norm that's getting created in this new kind of sector for the FDA to be involved in? How are they changing to all of this?
Well, first, thanks for having me. I think we're in a very interesting time. Like, Hannah covered very well sort of history, but I think it's important to remember that for many decades since the war on drugs was initiated, we didn't have any research at all. It was mostly happening through private foundations, academics. Hannah talked about Rick Doblin and MAPS really opening up the door, but being really solo on their own for almost 2 decades in terms of doing actual clinical trials. And we see a very healthy ecosystem now where there are a number of sponsors, including companies like Journey Colab, on the public side and the private side. We're seeing numerous investigator-initiated trials that are supported by the industry sponsors, which is also very healthy to see that there's this dialogue happening between clinical investigators or academic investigators alongside the drug sponsors themselves. A lot of this is motivated by the fact that for the sponsors, a drug safety database, depending on anywhere from 300 to 1,500 patients will be required. So the FDA is supporting that collaboration between investigators, independent investigators and sponsors. And alongside that, we're seeing much more academic research happening as well. And for the first time, we are seeing now federal funding for psychedelic research, which has not happened. I want to venture to say 60 years, but like many decades, the federal government has sat on the sidelines around funding research. And as most of us will know from life sciences and biotech, while there's a considerable amount of private funding that is important to early and late stage development, federal funding really does drive innovation. I think that's one of the amazing things about Western democracies, is that we have this investment in science and technology, and that has been missing for the last 60 years in psychedelics. And so what we're seeing is that there is more and more nuance and understanding between sponsors, whether that's industry sponsors or academic sponsors, and the regulators, and a lot of collaboration happening there, and pushing the envelope of what is the standard of psychedelic assisted therapy has been this tradition, the model that we again have borrowed from indigenous peoples and their way of carefully stewarding access to these, which has been 2 practitioners with 1 patient. But now we're seeing innovation there around what does group preparation or integration happening. Dr. Brian Anderson at the one of the co-founders of the center at Berkeley, which and one of our advisors, has done a study around group integration and group preparation, and we're also seeing at the Aquilina Cancer Center again a Compass sponsored study where I believe it's both Dr. Richards, Bill, and Brian have been working on simultaneous administration, and so we are seeing quite a bit of evolution and innovation, and I think it's all underpinned by this. What looks like, and I hope continues, coordination between industry sponsors, academics, and clinical research sites to see go beyond the first generation of what psychedelic assisted therapy look like to what it can look like, what can the practice of medicine open, and along the way we see that the regulators are working with sponsors, and it's moving towards a healthy evolution. I think we'll see an acceleration of research, which is very exciting.
And as well, with the industry kind of booming in a way, do you think that on the other hand, we are facing some really looming problems in our society, like the opioid crisis? I forgot the statistic, but the amount of overdoses that have happened since COVID has started has just skyrocketed. Do you think that is putting pressure on regulators too, that's kind of like looming over their head as, well, we have this issue that's going to come up at some point, our lawmakers are going to be pushing us about this stuff? Do you think that is also pressuring them to advance this research even more?
I think absolutely. I mean, like the shadow on everyone, regulators and drug developers, is that we are in the shadow of the opioid crisis. There's a similar one around amphetamines with the use of Ritalin and others, and even with benzodiazepines, there's a growing issue there. So while we talk a lot about the opioid crisis, there are several other issues that are happening, and I think that the FDA is correct in being cautious around the development of psychoactive drugs, but at the same time, they have been extremely supportive and helpful. And it's important to recognize, and I don't want to get into psychedelic exceptionalism, but there is a difference between the psychedelic class of compounds in terms of, while there is, there may be recreational use out there, they differ greatly, at least from opioids, in that the person misusing opioids does not become physically dependent or have intense drug cravings, both of which, as is seen in heroin or OxyContin, can lead to compulsive use and addiction. What we're grateful to see that the FDA wants to ensure the safety of patients in our trials, and insist, of course, that the post-marketing measures be put in place to reduce the risk of diversion and recreational use. So it's working with the regulators, not only in terms of the study design and the outcomes here, but I think there will be a very telling period, as Hannah mentioned, that MAPS is expecting FDA approval for MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder in 2024. Compass will soon follow with psilocybin for TRD, and what the REMS, so the risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, will be around that. So there are several ways that sponsors are working with the FDA to ensure that piece around safety, and not only the safety of efficacious use. And I think that it's telling that the FDA has given both MAPS and Compass breakthrough status designation for their programs, in that they see the urgency that you guys were just talking about earlier in terms of the clinical unmet need. I see this also with practitioners. There's this particularly in addictions. Journey Colab is developing mescaline for the treatment of alcohol use disorder, and amongst addiction providers, there is a lot of fear around a new magic pill after the opioid crisis, after the looming amphetamine and benzodiazepine crisis. But there's also, that's matched with this frustration around there not being any effective tools to work with. And so I think that we are seeing from the FDA and other regulators that they are hopeful that these drugs will offer new hope for patients suffering from addictions, mood disorders, and other hard to treat diseases, which we just haven't had any options for.
Yeah, you just mentioned breakthrough therapy. For those that aren't familiar with what that means exactly for the FDA, could you define what that means, how that
it's a big deal. I mean, the short answer is it's a big deal in that, what it means is that the FDA recognizes the unmet clinical need around depression, PTSD, and that they are prioritizing these programs. And this is very important in 2021 going into 2022, where we are in a golden age of biotech. Anyone who's doing drug development knows how difficult it is to work with CROs, just how limited the supply side market is. And that goes to the regulators too. And so I think this shows that the regulators understand the urgency and the need, and that they are doing as they should, which is prioritizing public health and safety. And that includes making sure that we have effective treatments for these otherwise difficult and other, where we don't have effective treatments currently. I want to be careful what we say. Like our current treatments are limited; they don't reach most people. And the fact that the FDA has given this breakthrough designation to 2 sponsors now, and we expect that to happen to more, is that they're prioritizing this need for patients.
Yeah, it sounds super promising. Thank you for that. I'm going to take it to Jon now. This panel is about the FDA approval process. We are familiar that this can take many, many years and millions of dollars. The process can be quite cumbersome. Are there any other alternative paths to get something approved with outside the FDA process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I apologize. I live in a rural area. If I start to cut out, I'll turn off my video. Just let me know, and I'll do that, because we don't always have the fastest internet in rural America yet.
Yeah, I'll let you know.
All right, thanks. As Hannah was mentioning earlier, Oregon has just blazed many trails in the last election through ballot initiatives that, on the one hand, decriminalized a number of different controlled substances at the state level, suggesting that if you get caught with one of those substances within certain limits of possession, all you're going to get from the law enforcement is either a $100 ticket, or you can waive the ticket in exchange for a like calling the drug treatment screening hotline kind of thing. So that's and on the other hand, Oregon also just passed Measure 109, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. It's Oregon's so-called Psilocybin Therapy Law that is going to allow supervised adult use of psilocybin beginning in 2023. And so there's kind of these state laws initiatives that can provide for businesses to operate and work with controlled substances at the state level. And then there's, of course, local initiatives that doesn't really create kind of the same business opportunities. And I think that's kind of the interest of probably most people attending this conference. And they deserve mention because it at least creates a culture that's going to, create potential clients or customers someday, once that kind of becomes, more legal instead of just, less sanctions if you get caught. And then the third thing I wanted to mention is something that it isn't wholly outside of the FDA process, but it is, it's a kind of a temporary workaround at least, and that is the recent Right to Try law that was passed actually during the Trump administration, if you can believe it. And that law, it basically says that if a patient's been diagnosed with some kind of life-threatening disease or condition, and they've exhausted all other treatment options, and they have been unable to participate in a clinical trial to access unapproved treatments, then they are able to participate in or receive certain substances that have at least gone through phase 1 successfully of the FDA process, without having completed the whole 3 phases. And so currently that would potentially create pathways for a number of Schedule 1 substances, such as psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, and then a number of novel compounds that have been developed by Selos Therapeutics, Trip Therapeutics, Cybin, Demerex, and Ulysses, and some others. And then, there's a number of other, controlled substances, psychedelics that are currently being in phase 1 that would add to that list, including DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, and mescaline, ayahuasca, and also a combination of MDMA and LSD. Maybe have at least, once those have passed phase 1, then they may be available under the right to try law. And this is, again, just primarily for people who have serious life-threatening conditions with a high likelihood of death unless the disease is stopped, basically. So that's not something that would be effective for everybody, but for early movers in the psychedelic space who are trying to, establish themselves as being having experience and working with these compounds, that would be a pathway to do that. And of course, we have to mention that Catherine Tucker at Emerge Law Group and is working on some really excellent litigation in Washington State right now, basically suing on behalf of doctors and patients for the right for terminal patients to be able to access psilocybin. And the DAA, for some reason, has decided that it's their business to insert themselves into medical practice, and the good folks there at Emerge are trying to put a stop to that, and basically make sure that that doctor-patient relationship isn't intruded upon unnecessarily. So that's kind of the couple of pathways that currently exist, that either circumvent or sort of shortcut the process. But even within the FDA, I think there's some interesting additional opportunities, as we're all here involved with. I think everyone is aware that ketamine is, these clinics are popping up all over the place, and that's being prescribed of what's called off-label. So what off-label actually means is that once somebody goes through all 3 phases of the FDA process and gains approval for a drug, that drug itself is what's kind of added to the official pharmacopoeia, and doctors have medical discretion to be able to prescribe a drug in a way that kind of deviates from the particulars of the research that allowed it to get sort of approved by the FDA. And so, like with ketamine is the classic example that we're all very familiar with. It wasn't initially being developed or marketed or researched as an antidepressant medication or something like that. It was, of course, an anesthetic for use in surgeries. And now, beginning in, I think, 2000 and possibly earlier, there was research showing that, and it wasn't through the FDA, it wasn't through that process, it was just independent research showing that it had efficacy for treatment of depression. And here we are 20 years later or more, and have, just kind of a whole kind of glut of ketamine clinics. But there are other drugs that are approved in the official pharmacopoeia that could, potentially also have off-label uses that could, for entrepreneurs and business folks and doctors, provide a potential pathway for other drugs. And so I'm thinking the easy one that might be low-hanging fruit for for folks, it would be, Marinol or Dronabinol or synthetic THCs that have been, approved through, the FDA, the phase 3 type of, I actually don't know when phase 3 came into effect, but they've gone through the FDA approval process. There's considered Schedule 3 for either chemotherapy, induced nausea or loss of weight or appetite with patients with HIV. There's also, interestingly, another synthetic THC in an oral solution called Syndros, which for some reason they have it Schedule 2 instead of Schedule 3 for treating weight loss in anorexia patients. And those are available clearly today in, the federal system. And, and given that we have kind of many states that have medical cannabis programs that doctors are out there prescribing THC, for all kinds of pain and anxiety. And, I'm kind of, in a sense, sort of surprised that there hasn't been more of that kind of like a ketamine style clinic being kind of created for THCs, particularly in states that don't even have medical programs, although gladly there's getting to be fewer and fewer of those. But there could be, certainly some options there for some kind of doctors who feel that it would be, appropriate and safe and an effective treatment to use some kind of synthetic THC for whatever those conditions may be. But then there's also other drugs in the pharmacopoeia that are in a similar status that could also be considered. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that these would be done, but there's, cocaine is Schedule 2 as a local anesthetic. Meth is also a Schedule 2 for ADHD, and morphine and even potentially PCP is a Schedule 2 drug that's it's kind of absurd to think that marijuana or cannabis is Schedule 1 with no medical use, but PCP and these other drugs that are even more stigmatized have some accepted medical use. But so even within drugs that have gone through the FDA approval process, there's these off-label opportunities, providing that a doctor can prescribe that ethically and within and staying within the lines of the standards of care that govern them. But of course, those standards of care are evolving standards that change over time as people learn more, and as attitudes. In some ways, it's also about attitudes changing. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned off-label, and I'm wondering if at some point, I think that there's opportunity with using these drugs as off-label, especially with the multitude of uses that psychedelics potentially have with people, not only mental health, but any kind of neurodegenerative disease. There's potential there. I'm wondering if there will be a backlash from the government if this is, quote unquote, abused too much. Do you think that the political weight that is carried with some of these compounds will make the government kind of pump the brakes on this? What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, that's a question of great speculation. I have heard some folks express concern that, like the kind of what's happening right now with ketamine kind of exceeds what like this is kind of in some ways a novel case, in the history of off-label use. I mean, I think it's about 1 in 5 drugs today that are prescribed off-label. So it's not like the practice of off-label prescriptions is in some way novel or kind of controversial. It's clearly established as part of best medical practice to use some of these kinds of ways that are off-label, but I think ketamine is different in a sense because it has the history of being I don't know what even is meant by a club drug, but but as having adult use or recreational use history, and it could, at some point, if that were to proliferate, it could result in there being kind of a tightening of that kind of lax ability and the restriction of the discretion that physicians have to make decisions that rely on their discretion. Yeah, and I think the other question that's also interesting about kind of the intersection of like a big pharmaceutical company with these kind of state law or local initiatives is something that Hannah was alluding to earlier. Is if you have billion-dollar companies that are highly vested and have an economic interest in maintaining kind of exclusivity over a drug, why wouldn't they kind of lobby or interfere with these kind of state law initiatives and rollouts? And we saw a little bit of that in Oregon. It made kind of some news, and I've only read the news articles, so I'm not speaking from like personal knowledge of this, I want to say, but Vice and others reported that Compass Pathways reached out to doctors and emailed them, and were trying to get them to kind of affect the rollout and try to stifle that process a little bit. And I've heard other commentators express concern that, particularly like in Oregon, in an extreme case, these big companies who have lobbyists could go to the DOJ or someone and kind of encourage prosecution for violation of federal drug law, even though it's completely in alliance with state law. And we didn't see a lot of that, or very extremely little of it in cannabis, but there weren't big businesses that, federal or, publicly traded companies, dealing in cannabis in the same way as the time that these state law initiatives are rolling out, like we do have in psychedelics. So, of course, it's all anybody's guess at this point, but that's kind of the thing that it's the hot topic right now.
Yeah, it's a big, let's wait and see what happens. So given that, Ahmad, do you think that FDA approval will be a catalyst for much wider acceptance of this space?
Yeah, I think in general, FDA is about safety. So they look at anything. Right now, they treat psychedelics just like any other investigational drug that goes before them in an IND package. And if you show a good safety package, toxicology, and all of that, except when it comes to psychedelics, they have to consult with the DEA, which is different than if you were developing, let's say, a heart drug. We haven't seen. We're in a little of a different space because we're trying to not to have to rely on Chuck Schumer having a drink with Mitch McConnell, if you will. We would like. We're working on non-hallucinogenic approach that doesn't really need any federal laws to be changed. I mean, as these are great points that the panel has raised, and I think the last point about how do you get a multi-billion-dollar multinational pharma company, which have the most powerful lobbyists in the world in Washington, to get behind this? If you're dealing with a scheduled drug that needs to be in a clinic that has a potential abuse, that is costly, and payers haven't really stepped up to pay, it will be very hard for the big pharma, if you will, to get behind this and really run through, no matter what the FDA does, in a way. But if the FDA is with you, and in a way, I'm going to say, quote unquote, no laws need to be changed, it will make it a lot easier for these groups to step up. I mean, if you remember beginning of President Obama's administration, he said, I'm going to have a drink with Mitch McConnell. And by the time he was leaving the office, he grew up by about, supposed to be 8 years, but he grew 25, 30 years. And someone asked him, what happened to that drink? He told the reporter, you go have a drink with Mitch McConnell. So I think it's right now, approximately half of the U.S. senators represent 40 million fewer American. The Republican senators represent 40 million fewer than Democratic senators, but they have equal power. So that tug of thing to change laws at this federal level, just like we were expecting for cannabis, hasn't really moved that much. Even though we had John Boehner as director of a cannabis company and so on. So what we think is trying to carve out is sort of a path of a lesser resistance in developing these non-hallucinogenic compounds. So we are doing a lot of chemistry and pharmacology work on 2-bromo-LSD, for example, that creates that path that say, if you really want to open the floodgates and have people seeking help, which I agree with 100% of what the panelists said so far in terms of this being a pandemic. It's a mental health pandemic that people suffer in silence, and they don't have a lot of resources to go to. So we think that FDA, from our perspective, FDA is not really an impediment. FDA has been, they go through they checked a lot of boxes. Do you have a CMC package? Do you have a toxicology package? Do you have your preclinical things for an IND? They don't really necessarily say, well, don't talk to us if this is a psychedelic. I mean, that's not what we're hearing in a way. So you would get that package before them, but again, it becomes, DEA controlled. Like some states, I mean, I'm in Canada, so we're federally legal. Cannabis is federally legal, and still, some of these issues are quite not really taken off in some ways. But if you want to get the psychedelics, which is a new frontier, in my opinion, of mental health treatment, and it's opening up long overdue. It's insane that opioids are they were legal all these years. Research was done. They're highly addictive and far more dangerous than psychedelics. And the good work of MAPS and Compass and all these people is sort of driving this ever so slowly, maybe glacial speed, maybe not as fast as we want. It's going to happen. At what speed? I think, as the panelist said, it's hard to say exactly when. It's like a prediction of something of some sort. But I think it's opening up options and possibilities that didn't exist before. And from our point of view, and these wonderful tools we have right now to look at molecules in different variations and things like that, is really going to make a big difference in the coming years, the way we are going to treat mental health.
Yeah. So what do you think the response from Big Pharma will be? When will they start sicking our lobbyists on Congress and telling them to put their foot down? Or will there just be an acceptance with the psychedelic movement, and will they just start buying up all of these companies that have started popping up, these drug development companies that have started popping up the last few years? What do you think is going to happen?
I think, again, I used to deal with Big Pharma. I was in the specialty pharma business in, acquiring assets from Big Pharma, had a lot of interactions with them. As long as there's a federal issue, federally illegal product that can affect the banking system, the way you finance them, the way you collect your money, like the old days of cannabis. In California, you had to go find a specialty credit union of some sort. Major banks didn't deal with you. That's one issue. The other one is pharmacoeconomic feasibility. When you're running the model, is this versus the cost of it? Is it feasible? Third thing is, would the payers pay for it? with the insurance companies. I've surveyed payers in the US. I mean, we're in Canada, it's a little different, but when you survey payers in the US, these guys are smart. They have more PhDs and MDs than we could hire. So they really go through this. So if those boxes don't check for big pharma, as well as, what does this look like peak sales? What's the protection in terms of IP? So you're on that 10-year model if you're having over $1 billion or $2 billion. And remember, big pharma is really big now. When I was a kid, there were 35, 40 big pharmas. Now there's like 7. And they're all much larger. There's no Ciba Geigy, Upjohn, Wyeth Ayers. All of these guys are either called Pfizer or Novartis. Quarter of the world's pharmaceutical sales is in one city, Basel in Switzerland, Roche and Novartis. That's a massive power in looking at these things. So they need to really look. Anything sub 200 million is not even worth it for them to. But for us to really go after this mental health pandemic and have a 10,000 man army that the big pharma has to rep doctors, to go educate doctors. We're going to be in P1, P2, P3 commercialization side of things. That's a business of a big pharma, not smaller groups. Our job is to get this through the proof of concept, get as many approvals as we can from the FDA, as whatever label claim we can get. But I think there's a few major issues right now for big pharma that they're just not stepping in a big way. They'll support through some of their smaller funds, some of the research, because they want to keep an eye on it, and if they will, things change. But again, it's going to be a few years before all these things come to play, that big pharma can step in and put their army behind this.
So interesting. So we are coming up on it's 1:52 right now. We're coming up on our time. There are a couple questions in the chat. And this question could be for you, Ahmad, or Jeeshan. What stops big pharma from excluding naturally occurring psychedelics from decrim in the future? Once they have their proprietary derivatives, they're going to want all the market for themselves, won't they? So I think it's, as decrim picks up speed across other local and state jurisdictions, will they actually intervene in this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear around what big pharma will do. I want to say that thus far we haven't seen much activity from big pharma on this, at least from our perspective. And at the same time, the problem that we're dealing with is so large that there's enough. We need to have multiple approaches to this, from traditional pharmaceutical approaches to new psychedelic assisted therapies to potentially second or third generation psychedelic inspired compounds, which we don't have any data for yet. There's some potential interesting compounds that people are working on, but there's no real clinical data. What we have now, what we know now from both traditional use as well as what's coming through the scientific and clinical data is that when psychedelics are paired with therapy, they're very powerful short course acute therapies, which is a huge paradigm shift from the traditional pharmaceutical model of taking a pill every day. So I think that rather than saying that there's going to be necessarily opposition between the two, we have this opportunity to create this new class of compounds, a new asset class of companies as well, and a new model of delivery where the value that's being created, at least in psychedelic assisted therapy, is shared between the sponsor and the manufacturer that's carrying the drug through the FDA and doing commercialization. And what we hope at Jardine Colab is this vibrant healing economy where there are local providers and locally owned centers who are using these approved products, and they are supplying or creating jobs that you can't outsource and that you can't automate, and the value that is shared across that. And I think for a number of companies, like, there's this question about, creating shorter acting psychedelics or trying to take out the hallucinogenic experience or the consciousness experience. There's not really data whether that will work out, but I think it's important to innovate, and we will need multiple tools across the tool set. But the idea of rather than concentrating wealth just with the drug manufacturer or the sponsor, but it being shared across this new model of delivery for us is very, very exciting in terms of what can new models of delivery be. But again, like the problems are so large that, from decriminalization to traditional like daily medications to psychedelic assisted therapy, whether they're long acting experiences or short acting experiences, we need all of these tools in the toolbox. And there will likely be a world where people will have a longer acting experience and then may go to a shorter acting experience and then may go to a daily medication, who then may want to participate in non-medical routes. And the hope is that it's a well-articulated system that people can move between the two. But, it is frustrating that often that people think, well, what's going to be the monopoly approach? A monopoly approach is not going to work for anyone. Every patient is different. Every community is different. And we need multiple approaches. And if you're just thinking about it from, well, who's going to make money? There is so much money being spent. Like we work in addictions where there's $42 billion that's being spent on addictions. We don't get much outcomes for it. And so like it to me is often frustrating. People are like, well, who's going to capture the whole thing? I'm like, we don't want anyone to capture the whole thing. Like it's very important that we have 3 vaccines and even more coming out. And if we look at the analogy again of the pandemic, having multiple tools to be able to reach different populations with different beliefs is very important to have.
I mean, let me add here. I think this is somewhat analogous to what happened in the cannabis space. As Jishan said, no one group is going to come in, corner and get the certain drug for a certain indication. But if you look at right now, you can get CBD products in stores in most states, in Canada legally. But there's also the CBD product that GW Pharma got approved by the FDA that you can get a prescription for. And that is what the doctor prescribes to you, that for seizures or whatever the indication is. So it's pretty much the same CBD, but it's dosed and manufactured differently. So in a way, GW didn't go and now is part of Jazz, didn't really go and corner the market on CBD. CBD is everywhere. So there's different classes, different label claim, different parts of this whole indication, which we call mental health, depression, seizures, and all of that we can address with these compounds. And I don't think one company, no matter how big they are, can corner this. And back to your question, yes, part of this will be intellectually IP protected, synthesized and standardized and all of that. That's going to be, but a big part of what we have is going to be at a level that is safe, but it's not nearly as controlled or a major label claim on it with the FDA stamp of approval. And I think these can coexist depending on who is seeking what, in terms of treatment.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I can't wait to see how everything progresses in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It's interesting because there's not an analogous industry that has kind of popped up that's similar to psychedelics. It'll be an entirely its own ecosystem that, hopefully we all will be participating in and providing input in. I think we are up on our time. I want to thank the panelists for joining me today, and thank you, Psychedelics Now. That was a great conversation. I'm excited we got to kick off the conference with this, and I'm excited to see what everyone does in the future. There's some really amazing companies that have their heart in the right place, doing the right thing, and just want to help people. And, I think that the panel comprised some of those. So thank you all for joining me and having this conversation with us. I hope the viewers learned something today. I know I did. So thank you all. And I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
That was great, Melissa, and to all the panelists, thank you so much for an incredibly informative and stimulating first panel. Hey, to all our attendees, there's breakout rooms in between the panels. Joe Moore, is going to be hosting a breakout table just in a few moments after I conclude remarks. So I encourage you. Joe's a real thought leader in our space, and actually is one of our sponsors that I want to thank, which is Psychedelics Today, as well as PsyIndex, as well as Psychedelics Go, of which I'm a principal, as well as the law firm Zuber Lawler. I'll just make a few concluding comments because I really thought that was stimulating. And yes, the FDA or EMA in Europe, or Health Canada in Canada, is definitely a path for a research company to enter, but it is also, in my opinion, as a career sort of venture capitalist, one with massive barriers to entry, and I say from a venture perspective, some of the riskiest capital that we're ever going to put. It's the longest tail bet, if you will, or investments of longest tail. And my view is there's going to be a very small number of succeeding candidates. There will not be, I think, 100 FDA-approved psychoactive based medications, even though there may be 100 people per 100 companies or more pursuing that. Sorry to say that, but drug development is very expensive, very time consuming. In my opinion, many of the good faith companies pursuing it won't necessarily get there. And part of that is political. And Ahmad mentioned Epidiolex, which is the product he was talking about, which I will say is not exactly a CBD product. It's a high CBD, low THC, but it is above the legal limit that constitutes what would be, say, CBD under the Farm Bill in America, and THC. It's actually a THC product, but it is agreed not a unique. But I only mentioned it because that's the only organic cannabinoid product that the FDA has ever approved to date. And we've been at this in cannabis for a number of years now as well. Yes, there are marijuana, but they're synthetics. They're different, and they're average products by any user experience. So what really excites me is this whole other delivery system that can emerge and coexist in a regulatory compliant way outside the traditional EMA and FDA path. And I think that's for patients, for entrepreneurs, for investors, for healthcare practitioners, that's a really exciting, maybe the most exciting, but still somewhat amorphous industry. So there's a lot of room to introduce healing therapies without necessarily going to that highly expensive, massive barrier to entry FDA or EMA or Health Canada route. And I think that we have to hope and expect that that's where some of the most innovation is going to come from. And yes, a small handful of candidates will get through those pearly gates and make it all the way to being an approved product that any doctor can prescribe without risk of malpractice and to be covered by an insurer. And insurance, as we'll talk about in the next panel, is an important issue that affects all these things. Thanks so much again to all of our engaged audience, our content providers, brilliant stuff, as well as our sponsors. I encourage everyone to go to the breakout room, and we'll see you again for the ketamine panel in exactly 27 minutes.